Do you believe that sometimes the poorest choices hide the richest destinies? This is the story of a poor village girl who was forced to marry a man everyone thought was nothing more than a beggar in torn clothes. Not knowing he was, in truth, a billionaire in disguise. Adha was a girl who never asked much from life. She wanted nothing more than a simple existence, singing softly to her mother in the evenings, tending to the small backyard where she grew herbs and vegetables, and dreaming of one day finding true love. Her world was small, but in her heart lived a fire that kept her smiling through every hardship. But her father, Bacheri, was not like her. He was a hard man, stern and sharp in his words, a man whose eyes never looked straight at others. His head was always lowered, not from humility but from shame, weighed down by debts he could not pay. The village chief, a man both feared and avoided, held those debts like chains around his neck, and so, with no land, no animals, no money left to give, Bacheri turned to the one thing he still had power over, his daughter. To him, Ada was not a girl with songs in her heart or dreams in her eyes. She was a coin, a way to erase his disgrace. In his eyes, her marriage would not be a blessing, but a payment. And that is how Ada, a girl of light and hope, was sold into a union that carried no joy, no music, no celebration. Her groom was a man the villagers barely noticed. Mediva was always quiet, his face hidden under dirt and dust, his clothes worn and patched. He moved through the village like a shadow, invisible and unimportant. To everyone he was nothing but a poor farmer, another man struggling to survive. Nobody knew his story, nobody asked. And so when Ada was forced to stand beside him, she felt her heart sink deep into the ground. To her, her dreams had died that day, buried under the weight of her father's debt. What she didn't know was that this stranger she was tied to was hiding a truth so deep, so powerful, that one day it would turn the entire village upside down. The morning of the wedding arrived heavy and silent. The sun rose high, shining mercilessly as if mocking Ada's pain. Its heat burned the heads of the villagers who had gathered, curious eyes fixed on the poor girl being sent into her fate. But there were no songs, no drums, no laughter. Not even the birds dared to sing. The air itself seemed to stand still, thick with sorrow. The wedding feast was a sad sight. A dry cornbread placed on a worn mat stood in for a cake. A few crooked candles struggled to stand, leaning as if too tired to keep burning. Beside them, a gourd filled with well water waited to serve as a blessing. But there were no flowers, no garlands, no music. Children ran about playing with stones, their laughter piercing through the silence, too young to understand the weight falling on Ada's shoulders. Her dress was borrowed, its hem already stained. Her veil was so thin it looked like nothing more than a rag to wipe away sweat. Her eyes, once so alive, looked empty, like a field left dry after years of drought. Each step toward her groom felt like burying another piece of her heart. Mediva stood waiting. He didn't lift his eyes. He didn't fix his shirt. He didn't move at all. He stared at the ground, quiet, distant, as though he wasn't even part of his own wedding. The whispers began around them. "Those who marry without joy live without light," one villager murmured. Another old woman shook her head and whispered, "That girl will wither like a flower thrown into the fire." When the chief raised a dry branch to seal the marriage, Adha's body trembled. Her knees almost gave way, but she closed her eyes and took a long breath, seeing her mother's face in her mind. Far back, her father stood with arms crossed, lips pressed tight, determined to look strong, though inside he feared any voice of protest. For him, this was not about his daughter's life. It was about erasing his shame. The claps that followed were colder than the morning air, weak, hollow claps without music, without love. To Adha, each one felt like a slap across her face, a reminder that her worth meant nothing to anyone there. No one cared about her dreams, about the nights she spent singing verses by the fire with her mother. No one remembered her hopes. They only saw her as her father did. Payment? The ceremony ended, and silence swallowed the village. Neighbors returned to their homes carrying empty pots, muttering, "When the poor marry, not even God sings." The men walked away shaking their heads, already sure this marriage would end in sorrow. Adha lowered her head as she walked away, lifting the heavy dress to avoid tripping. Behind her, Medeva followed with slow, dragging steps, carrying a sack of corn as if it were just another burden in his life. There was no hand to hold, no glance exchanged. They looked like two strangers sentenced to the same fate. At the gate of her father's house, Ada turned back one last time. She saw her mother standing still, hands pressed against her chest, as though trying to keep her heart from breaking in two. And in that moment, Ada understood. This marriage was not the start of life together. It was the beginning of her own lonely path, one she would walk with her tears. The dust clung to her dress, making it heavier with each step. Each movement forward felt like a prayer, a desperate call to God. Please, don't let me die in sadness before I know the reason for this pain. When the voices of the villagers faded, only her heartbeat remained, loud in her chest, as if warning her that something about this story was both wrong and right at the same time, something only time could reveal. The wind rose, lifting dust and carrying away a few dried petals that had been tossed carelessly. That was no wedding. It was a funeral of dreams. But the elder women of the village always said, "In every burial, God plants a hidden seed, a seed that sprouts only when pain turns to faith, and silence turns to courage." And so the wedding ended without joy or song. At the threshold of her new life, Adha buried what was left of the girl she had been. Without knowing it, she began the birth of the woman who would one day make the whole village bow their heads and swallow every cruel laugh. The walk to Medeva's house felt endless. Each stone bruised her feet, each thorn caught her dress. The silence between them was so thick, it seemed to speak louder than words. When they finally reached the house, the moon hung high, casting a cold glow that touched the straw roof. The clay walls were cracked like old wounds. The wooden door leaned crookedly, and the single small window was covered with cloth. Ada's chest rose and fell quickly. She wanted to run back into her mother's arms, but her legs were too heavy to move. Medeva pushed the door open. The creak echoed into the night, louder than her breath. Inside, darkness swallowed everything. The smell of smoke, corn, and damp earth clung to the air. On the ground, a thin mattress lay in one corner, covered by a blanket worn with time. Medeva stepped in first, dropped the sack, removed his shirt, and stood silently, eyes lowered. Adha hugged herself, trying to hold together the trembling in her body. Slowly he turned and looked at her, only for a moment, like a stranger glancing by mistake. Then he spoke softly, almost whispering, "You don't owe me anything." Ada froze. Those words struck her harder than any slap could have. She had braced herself for roughness, for pain, for force. But instead she was met with gentleness. The fear she had carried all day, as heavy as a mountain, began to crumble into dust. Medeva laid a mat in the far corner, turned to the wall, and lay down quietly. His silence was not cruel. It carried weight, stories unspoken. Ada sat on the mattress, eyes on her hands, heart pounding with confusion. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, God, for not letting me die of shame tonight." The night stretched long. The wind whistled through the cracks, and every sound outside made her jump. But Medeva never crossed the line between them. He stayed where he was. In the middle of the night, she heard a sound. A deep sigh, heavy with sorrow, as if someone was crying quietly into the blanket. She turned and saw him trembling, his body hidden under the cloth. For a moment she wanted to ask, but bit her lip. Perhaps he too carried wounds no one could see, cracks in his heart as deep as those in the walls. When the rooster crowed for the first time, announcing a new day, Adharma was still awake, her face swollen from holding back tears, eyes fixed on the small slit in the window, waiting for a sign, a light, an answer. Medeva got up before sunrise, rolled up the mat, put on his worn-out shirt, and left without a word. She remained seated, hugging her knees, feeling the cold creep up her legs. She didn't know whether to cry or give thanks, didn't know if she was a prisoner or a guest. But that night, even without a single embrace, she discovered something her father would never understand: the value of silent respect. The clay house had become a mute temple, where each breath carried a plea for mercy. The thin mattress turned into an altar of survival, and that dark corner became the first stage where Adma began to realize that sometimes the greatest form of care doesn't come from touch, but from the space someone gives you to simply exist. When she finally stood up to warm water, her face reflected a mix of fear and relief, and deep in her eyes, well hidden, a thread of curiosity began to bloom. Curiosity about who that man really was. The one who chose to sleep on the floor so he wouldn't take the last thing she still had. Her dignity. When the sun tore through the sky with its fiery spears, Medivh was already up. The Ruers' crow still echoed between the palm trees. Ash walked out, a hoe slung over his shoulder and a bag of rags he called lunch in hand. From inside the clay house, Adharma listened to his footsteps fade along the dirt road, and felt a tightness in her chest. Not longing, not fear, but a silent question. What hides behind that silence? Each morning she was left alone, wrapped in the blanket that smelled of smoke and earth. Little by little she began sweeping the floor, organizing the few utensils, tidying up the yard. The silence in the house was so deep that the sound of the broom felt like thunder. She could hear in the distance the laughter of women at the well, their chatter about weddings, births, fights. None spoke of her with affection. It was always the same sentence. She married a mute. She dry up and die. At first, Adama didn't have the courage to prepare anything for him. She feared being rejected, humiliated, or worse, ignored. But one afternoon, when the sky turned the color of clay and the wind carried the scent of rain, she decided to make a thin porridge using a handful of flour stored in a cracked pot. The porridge was nearly water, but it was her first offering. She placed it in a dented metal plate and set it on the crooked table along with a cup of fresh water. When Mehdi returned, his face and hands were so caked with dirt, he looked like he'd come straight from underground. He entered slowly, looked at the plate, then at her. She sat in a corner, twisting a scarf in her hands. Without saying a word, he approached, sat down, and ate. Each spoonful was slow, as if he were meditating on every grain. When he finished, he looked up and nodded silently, a gesture that for Adharma felt like a whispered thank you in the dark. From that day on, it became routine. She began to cook small portions, saltless rice, thin cassava soup, a handful of beans. And he, always the same way, ate slowly, thanked her with a glance or a subtle nod, and then stepped outside, sat on a stone, and stared at the horizon until nightfall. The villagers, ever hungry for gossip, didn't take long to start inventing stories. One woman, known for having a tongue sharper than a butcher's knife, spread rumors that Adamar lived like a prisoner, that her husband was mute and dumb, that she went hungry and cried every night. They laughed loudly by the well, never thinking about the pain their words could sow. One afternoon, Adama went to gather firewood in the nearby forest. While picking up dry branches, she heard two women laughing and saying, "She thinks she married, but she married loneliness. She married silence." Those words pierced her like thorns. For a moment she lowered her head and wished she could vanish, turn to dust, evaporate in the day's heat. But instead she kept collecting wood, eyes fixed on the ground, hands steady, her heart bleeding in silence. When she returned, she found Medivh sitting on the floor cleaning his hoe, his face burned by the sun, his neck dusty, eyes downcast. Adhama set the firewood by the door, entered the makeshift kitchen, and began preparing soup. The water boiled slowly, releasing steam that rose like a prayer, drifting gently toward the thatched roof. She stirred the pot calmly, as if rocking a child to sleep. Medivh came in, sat in his usual corner, waiting. When the soup was ready, she served it in a deep bowl, placed it in front of him, and without hesitating, sat on the floor, facing him. For the first time, they ate together. Neither spoke. But in that shared silence, something shifted between one spoonful and the next. Their eyes met, full of questions neither dared to ask. Then the days that followed, Adama began to observe more. She noticed how Medivh left before the first Ruer's crow, how his hands bled from cracks that never healed, how the silence grew heavier at the end of each day. At night she heard his dragging steps, the sound of him washing his feet outside, his tired sigh before lying down on the mat. It was then, in the rhythm of their daily life, that a Dharma began to understand. Mediva's greatest pain wasn't hissolence. It was carrying an entire world inside his chest with no one to share it with. And without realizing it, she began to admire that dirt-covered man, quiet yet, who returned home every day, exhausted but whole. When the moon appeared full, lighting the yard, a Dharma would sit at the doorway, gazing at the stars, and without knowing it, she began to pray, not just for herself, but for him too, asking God to strengthen those wounded hands, to bring peace to that unknown heart. And deep down, she gave thanks, even without words, for not being touched by force, for not being humiliated in the dark. Little by little, she understood that Mediva's silence spoke volumes. It said that respect can be more valuable than gold, that a shared bowl of soup can mean more than a feast full of false laughter. The villagers could mock all they wanted, but inside that clay house, a new story was beginning to be written. A story without words, but filled with gestures that only those who've had their soul torn apart can truly see. Time in the village isn't measured by clocks. There each day is counted by the crow of roosters, the sound of hoses striking the earth, the smell of fires lit at dusk. And so between one silence and another, a Dharma and Mediva woo a quiet routine. She prepared the food, cleaned the house, cared for the little they had. He left early, returned tired, always silent. It was a mute marriage, a union of two living ghosts. But everything changed on a cold night when the wind blew harder than usual. The sky seemed heavy with tears it couldn't shed. Adama awoke with her body heavy, fever burning inside her like fire lit in every bone. She tried to get up, but her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the dirt floor, breath short, eyes spinning, the world swirling like a dust storm. Mediva, who slept in the corner, heard the fall. He jumped up, a rare thing for him, and rushed to her. For the first time, his silence turned into urgency. He picked her up gently as if cradling a wounded bird. Her skin burned, her dry lips begged for water. He laid her on the thin mattress, tucked the blanket around her with trembling hands, and ran out into the brush without saying a word. Minutes later, he returned with green leaves, roots, a handful of herbs pressed tight against his chest. Heated water, chopped the leaves with a dull knife, mixed everything in a gourd. The bitter smell filled the house. Carefully, he moistened her lips one drop at a time as if afraid of drowning her. All the while, he wiped the sweat from her brow with an old cloth. That night, Mediva didn't leave her side. He sat next to her, holding her hand, watching her every movement, every breath. Sometimes he murmured words she couldn't understand. Prayers, maybe, or old confessions, or quiet talks with a god only he knew. When a Dharma trembled, he pulled the blanket up to her neck. When she coughed, he leaned in, caressed her hair, and gripped her hand tightly as if to say, "I'm here." The fire died down, but Mediva didn't sleep. The night crept forward slowly, like a snake slithering across sand. The silence was deep, but full of invisible words. At dawn, when the rooster sang its first call, a Dharma opened her eyes, weak but alive. She saw Mediva sitting beside her, red-eyed, dark circles under his eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper. Still, she forced the words, "Why ... Why do you treat me kindly when I was thrown at your door like a burden?" Mediva lowered his head, took a deep breath. For a moment it seemed he might answer, but instead he only squeezed her hand tighter. With his thumb he wiped away a tear that had rolled down her cheek. A simple gesture, but so full of truth that no words could ever match it. In that instant, something broke inside Adama. The old fear, the resentment, the shame, it all turned to dust. For the first time she truly saw the man behind the silence. He wasn't a monster or a brute or a soulless mute. He was a man carrying a weight no one else could see. Someone who knew how to care in silence, love without demanding, protect without boasting. The days that followed were different. There was still silence, but it was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. Adama began to wait for Mediva at the door, holding a gourd of fresh water, her gaze saying more than any greeting. He, upon arriving, would wash his face, sit beside her, stay quiet but present. At night she would mend an old scarf while he sharpened his hoe. Their silence was now a kind of rest, not a prison. The women of the village kept mocking. They said Adharma had gone mad, that she lived like a widow with a living husband. But she no longer listened. Her soul was too busy trying to understand. This man who chose to care instead of speak, who traded words for gestures, who carried love in the palms of his wounded hands. On the last night before the new harvest cycle, Adhama sat watching Medeva by lamplight. He slept in the corner, embraced by hissolence. She thought of her father, her mother, the cruel words of the village. She thought of the promises she made to herself when she was still a girl. I'll marry someone who looks me in the eyes. I'll be happy. And then there in the middle of the mud, body still weak, she understood she may have found what she asked God for, even if in a twisted, hidden, rough way. Medeva's gesture that night when he held her hand was the key that unlocked a door in her chest. A door her father had shut with shouting that the village had locked with cruel laughter, that she herself thought she'd never open again. Now, even without a single word, Medeva was showing her that a woman's dignity doesn't live in parties or rings or clean dresses. It lives in quiet care, in respect planted. Slowly, in patience that blooms even in the mud. The next morning, Adha rose before the sun. For the first time, she felt the cold floor under her feet without flinching. The cold now felt like life. She prepared hot water, dropped in a handful of herbs, and waited for Medeva to wake. He opened his eyes slowly, saw the steam rising, smelled the bitter scent, and looked at her with quiet surprise. She smiled a small but steady smile as if to say, I see you, and you see me. And in that shared silence, the first roots of a love began to grow. A love no one would dare believe if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. The weeks passed like a silent river. The rains came and went, washing the dust from the roads, leaving puddles that reflected a cracked sky. Little by little, Adhama began to walk through the house like someone who belonged there. Her hands now touched the utensils with care, as if blessing an object with newfound tenderness. Medeva kept his same rhythm, leaving early. Returning sunburned, his clothes full of dust and a silence that now carried a different weight, a different scent. Adharma no longer saw just a quiet man. She saw someone who, despite carrying the world on his back, looked at her with the care of someone who understands pain without needing words. One afternoon, while tidying up, Adhama decided to clean a corner she had never touched. There, behind a pile of old sacks, she found a small wooden chest. The lock was broken, and it looked like it had been forgotten long ago. Her heart began to race. A tambourine in her chest, a mix of curiosity and fear, a thirst to understand who this man really was, the one who slept on the floor to avoid stealing her dignity. With trembling hands, she opened the chest. Inside, she found papers, old letters, black and white photographs, some with torn edges, others stained beyond time's forgiveness. There was also a simple gold ring with the initials Ma engraved inside. She picked it up, turned it one way, then the other. Those letters danced in her mind like riddles in the dark. The letters, written in firm handwriting, spoke of business, farms, distant bank accounts, commercial partnerships. There were signed contracts, invitations, 2 meetings in big cities, and photos of Medeva wearing fine suits, standing beside important men. In one photo, Medeva was smiling, something she had never seen before. A smile that carried a peace he seemed to have buried long before arriving in the village. Adhama sat on the floor. Papers spread around her. Sunlight streamed through a crack in the wall, lighting every piece of that hidden life. The questions came in waves. Who is this man? What is he doing here? Why hide all this? Why choose to live in dust, in silence, in solitude? For a moment she wanted to run to the village and tell everyone, but the thought died before it could fully form. Something deep inside told her that this secret wasn't a weapon. It was a wound. A wound Medeva protected like someone guarding. A scar that still hurt. She gathered the papers, closed the chest gently, and placed it back in the dark corner. She sat there, holding the ring tightly in her hand, the cold metal burning her skin. For a moment she imagined the life Medeva had left behind. Lit ballrooms, fine clothes, fake laughter, promises of power, all traded for a clay house, a thin mattress, and the company of a woman who came into his life like a sentence. When Medeva came home that night, he found a different Adama. Hiri's were deeper, glowing like someone carrying thunder inside. She didn't ask anything. She didn't show what she had seen. She simply set the food on the table, served water, and sat in the corner, watching his every move with a new kind of attention. Medivh noticed he looked at her more than once, trying to decipher the silence now coming from her. His hands trembled slightly, but he said nothing. He ate in silence, washed his hands in the bucket outside, and returned with heavy steps. That night, lying on his mat, Medivh took longer to sleep. He kept turning from side to side, whispering softly as if speaking to an invisible friend. Adma, lying on the mattress, heard every sound, every breath, and for the first time she felt no fear, no anger, only compassion. A compassion born from shared pain, from the recognition that they were both prisoners of stories they hadn't chosen. At dawn, when he left for the fields, Adha stood at the doorway looking at the sky. She had the ring in her dress pocket like a talisman. She felt the wind on her face, carrying the scent of damp earth. In that moment, she decided she would tell no one. She would guard the secret like someone guarding a rare seed. That day, stirring a pot of porridge, she thought about the women who mocked her, the father who had sold her, the mother who wept in silence. She'd thought about the value people placed on titles, on gold, on names. And there, as the porridge thickened, she realized that true value lives in gestures, in silent choices, in sacrifices no one sees. The little chest hidden in the shadows became a secret altar in Adama's heart. She didn't know when or how, but she felt that this secret was the key to something greater, and that sooner or later, the truth would rise from the darkness, like a seed breaking through the clay to reach the sun. That night before sleeping, Adhama held the ring once more. She ran her finger over the engraved letters, closed her eyes, and whispered softly, "May God protect the man you are, not the man the world wants you to be." It was the first prayer she made for him, not as a stranger, but as someone who was finally beginning to understand him. And so, in the clay house, between guarded secrets and shared silences, Adama began to truly see the man behind the silence. And without knowing it, she was preparing her own heart for a destiny not even the oldest seer in the village would dare to predict. That morning the sky woke heavy, as if carrying a secret in its clouds. The wind blew warm, lifting the red dust that clung to skin. Two faces, two souls? Medivh left early as always, his hole resting on his shoulder, his bare feet marked by old color. Zadama stayed behind, preparing the thin porridge, listening to the distant chatter of women at the well. As she stirred the pot, a chill ran down her spine like a warning whisper at the back of her neck, telling her this day wouldn't be like the others. Still surrounded by the smell of the cooking porridge, Adama heard voices approaching. Loud laughter, hurried steps, a restless energy in there. Two women well known in the village for the poison they carried on their tongues passed in front of the house. One held a gourd full of water, laughing loudly, nudging the other with her elbow, savoring the cruelty. Poor Adma. They say she cries every day, dying inside. Married to that mute who doesn't even have the courage to look her in the eye, spat the first. The other replied, laughing even harder, "She thinks she's refined, but look at her eating leaf soup, sleeping on a floor mat. They say her husband won't even touch her. She wither like a leaf in the sun." The words pierced to Damer's chest like spears. The spoon slipped from her hand, clanging dryly against the pot. She stood still, eyes fixed on the open door, her blood racing, her face burning. Inside her, a mix of pain and rage surged like lava, ready to explode. Medivh, who had heard everything from the other side of the fence, stopped. He dropped the hoe, raised his head slowly. The men working beside him took notice. They had never seen him react, never heard him raise his voice. His silence was as certain as the sunrise. But that day, something broke. He began walking toward the village square, his steps firm, his chest puffed like a thunderstorm held in his heart. When the women saw him coming, they laughed even louder. "Look at that! The mute came to thank us. Going to cry too." "Mute," one shouted, nearly doubled over with laughter. Medivh stopped in the middle of the square. The children stopped playing. The men dropped their tools. The women stopped scrubbing their laundry. The air stood still as if the world itself held its breath. Then he raised his voice, a deep, steady voice, heavy with years of buried pain. "You laugh at her, but you don't know what it means to have a clean soul. You call her poor, but you don't know what true wealth is." The square fell silent. His words echoed off the clay walls, returning even louder. Medeva continued, eyes blazing, fists clenched by his sides. "She is not a prisoner. She is richer than anyone here. You may have full pots and pretty clothes, but you have no courage, no truth in your chest." The women bit their lips. Some shrank back, others turned away. The village chief, watching from his porch, lowered his head and slowly nodded. Medeva breathed deeply, looking around. "What you call weakness is the greatest strength there is. Her silence is the loudest cry God hears, and mine too." Then he turned, picked up the hoe from the ground, and walked back the same path. His steps strong, his head high. The people made way as if a king were passing. Adama, standing in the doorway, had seen it all. Her legs trembled, her eyes brimmed with tears, but for the first time her chest stood tall. When Medeva returned home, he dropped the hoe in the corner and breathed deeply. Adama approached slowly, her face still damp, and held his hand. They said nothing. They didn't have to. That touch was a declaration of war against the world outside, a silent promise that even without words, they belonged to one another. That day, Adama made the soup with a bit more salt, something simple but stirred with a new flame in her heart. When she served it, Medeva looked at her and for the first time smiled. A small, timid smile, but real. A smile worth more than any hidden treasure. Outside, the village still whispered. Some said Medeva had lost his mind. Others claimed his wife had witchcraft in her gaze. But inside that clay house, Ada and Medeva had discovered that dignity isn't measured in coins or in mocking laughter. It's measured in the courage to hold someone's hand when the whole world wants to see you fall. That night, as the lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls, Adama lay down staring at the ceiling and repeated silently, "He spoke for me. He saw me." And in that phrase, hidden in the dark, bloomed a peace that only grows when someone chooses to defend you, not with shouts or weapons, but with raw truth spoken in the middle of the square in front of everyone. And so that night, the house stopped being a prison. It became a fortress, an altar, and their silence, once heaviest stone, turned into music only strong hearts can hear. The days following Medeva's speech in the village square passed like a warm gust of wind, carrying rumors and silences. The sharp tongues of the village quieted for a while, as if choking on their own lies. But the world doesn't stop for anyone's words. And Adama's life went on now with a quiet glow in her eyes, a firmer step across the yard, a silence that no longer weighed her down but shielded her. A minute, Adama's mother remained, ill-bound to the straw mat that creaked beneath her frail body. Her face resembled a dry leaf marked by every tear, every sleepless night, every promise of better days that never came. She lived on thin soups, herbal teas, and the small comfort of staring into the backyard through a crack in the window, imagining the smell of roasted corn she could no longer taste. One day, as Medeva returned from the fields, found Adam standing in the yard, eyes lost on the horizon. Her hands held a gourd, but her gaze was far away, perhaps on the days when she chased chickens through the backyard, or the nights she sang to her mother. Medeva dropped the hoe and approached. He didn't ask anything. He just looked into her eyes, and in that silence, Adhama confessed without a word, "My mother is getting worse." That night, after their simple dinner, Medeva left without saying where he was going. Adhama stayed awake, sitting at the edge of the mattress, listening to every sound of the night. The crickets, the rustling of dry leaves, the distant lowing of cows. Her heart beat fast, and anguish climbing her throat like a knot. Dot. Hours later, Medeva returned. In his hands, he carried a bundle of fresh roots and leaves tied with vine. His face was sweaty, breath heavy. He came in, dropped the bundle on the table, and began preparing a strong tea. He chopped the roots with a dull knife, crushed the leaves with his calloused hands. The bitter scent filled the house, stinging Adam's eyes, yet bringing a strange sense of hope. The next morning, Medeva left early again, but not to the fields. He went to Aminata's house unnoticed, carrying a clay pot filled with the tea he had prepared. When he arrived, he found Aminata lying still, eyes closed, her face pale as ash. Without a sound, he lifted her head, touched the cup to her cracked lips, and helped her drink one drop at a time. Aminata opened her eyes slowly, startled. When she saw Medeva, she tried to speak, but no voice came. He simply placed a finger on his lips, asking for silence. Then he tucked in her thin blanket, held her hand for a few moments, and left without looking back. In that brief touch, Aminata felt something she hadn't felt in years. Someone caring for her without demands, without contempt, without rushing to leave. The days passed, and Medeva repeated the ritual. Before dawn, he would go into the woods to gather herbs, prepare teas, and bring them in secret. Meanwhile, he helped in his father-in-law's field. Old Bacheri, though physically strong, bore a hardened soul. He received Medeva with disdain, ignored his presence, pretended not to see his hands lifting corn, carrying heavy sacks of cassava. To Bacheri, the debt repaid with his daughter had been humiliation enough. Accepting help from his son-in-law was another blow to his pride. But Medevan ever complained. He endured the cold stars, the harsh words, the shveys. He wiped sweat from his brow, lifted the sacks, and kept going. At night, he'd return home with aching shoulders, throbbing knees, yet still made soup for a dharma, laid out his mat, and prayed softly, as if thanking God for enduring another day. One afternoon, while washing clothes at the river, a woman who often mocked a dharma came near and said, "Heard your husband's running after your mother like a dog. Think she'll earn her blessing, huh? Thinks he'll wash off the shame your father left on him." Adhama clutched the bundle of clothes tightly, veins pulsing in her hands. She didn't answer. She just looked up at the sky, searching for patience where there was none left. When she got home, she found Medeva sitting in the yard, sewing a tear in his shirt. His silence was so full of meaning that a dharma knelt in front of him, rested her forehead against his sweaty chest, and let her tears fall. Medeva didn't understand right away, but he wrapped his arms around her in a heavy, tender hug, a hug that said, "I'm with you, even when the whole world turns its back." That night, after Adharma fell asleep, Medeva sat watching the lamplight flicker. He thought of the mother he never had by his side, the cold nights in the big city, the parties where he was applauded, but never loved. He thought of the silence, the clay, the thin soup, and there holding the wire to finish sewing his shirt. He whispered, "May God make me strong, not rich. Give me soul before gold." Meanwhile, Aminata slowly began to recover like a root, sprouting after drought. Color returned to her face. Light returned to her eyes. One morning, she woke up, held Adharma's hand, and said with a hoarse voice, "He's poor in coin, but rich in soul." It was the first time Aminata spoke of him without fear, bitterness, or regret. Adhama held her mother's hand and wept silently, and deep in her chest, a certainty was born. The worth of a man isn't measured by the gold in his pocket, but by the love he carries in his hands. In the village, no one knew what Medeva had done. The sharp tongues didn't see it. The curious eyes missed it. His care was as silent as morning dew, as invisible as true kindness. And so little by little, while the gossip spread lies, Medeva planted seeds of dignity watered with sweat, patience, and quiet love in that clay house where wind slipped through the cracks and the cold stung their feet. Adha and Medeva began building a new way of living, a love that needed no audience, that begged for no applause, a love proven in small gestures, in remedies made at dawn, in sacks of corn carried without a word, in an embrace that consoles without speaking a single thing. The sun was preparing to lie down behind the mountains when a strange sound shattered the silence of the village. It was the sound of heavy wheels, horses' hooves beating the dirt road, voices that didn't belong to that simple soil. Children ran to sea, men left their fields, women abandoned pots over fire, all wide-eyed, sniffing out novelty dot at the village gate. A man stepped out of a dusty car, wearing a light-colored suit and shoes that gleamed like silver in the sun. His face was serious, but his eyes scanned every corner, searching like someone hunting for something precious. The villagers whispered behind fences, curiosity burning in their throats. The man wiped sweat from his brow, opened his arms, and shouted loud enough to be heard at the river. "Dr. Medeva, I've come to take you back. You've stayed here long enough." The name echoed like thunder in a dammer's soul. Inside the clay house, she dropped the water pot she was holding, its contents spilling across the floor like silent tears. Her heart pounded, her chest felt too small for so much shock. Medeva, returning from the field with the hose slung over his shoulders, stopped. His steps grew heavy, breath caught in his throat. The hose slipped from his hand, raising a cloud of dust. He looked at the man at the gate, then at Adharma, who now stood in the doorway, clutching the frame like it was her lifeline. The man in the suit ran to Medeva, gripped his shoulders, and shook him with forced cheer. "Doctor, everyone in the city's waiting for you. Your partners, your staff, the board of directors. You disappeared, vanished without warning. What are you doing here among these peasants?" The entire village froze. Even the chickens fell silent. The women pressed their lips. The men furrowed their brows. The silence blanketed everyone like a heavy sheet. Medeva lowered his gaze, took a deep breath. When he looked up again, his eyes were bright, not with joy but with an old aching pain. In a firm voice he said, "I came here because I wanted to be seen as a man, not as a currency. I wanted someone to look at me without weighing my gold." The man in the suit looked around confused, a nervous grin tugging at his lips. "But doctor, you own land, businesses, entire cities. You have employees depending on your leadership. You're one of the richest men in the country." Adama heard every word like hammer blows to the soul. Her breath caught. The ground seemed to sway. She stepped back, clutching her scarf to her chest, her legs weakening. She felt betrayed, and at the same time saved. Betrayed by Hysolence, saved by his care, Medeva turned toward her. Their eyes met, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken confessions. He walked slowly, each step a silent plea for forgiveness. When he stood in front of her, he pulled from his pocket the gold ring, the same one she had once found in the chest. He held it out to her with a trembling hand. "Yes, I own riches, but here I learned the value of silence, the value of respect. I ran away because I wanted to be loved without my fortune being part of the decision. I wanted to be chosen for who I am, not for what I have." His voice broke at the end. Adama collapsed to the ground, holding the scarf to her chest, her tears releasing what her heart could no longer hold. The neighbors watched from a distance, some with mouths agape, others with hands over their faces. None had ever imagined the man they called mute and filthy was actually one of the most powerful to ever set foot in the village. Medeva knelt before her, took her hands. "I understand if you want to leave. I lied through silence, but never in my care. Every tea, every firewood bundle, every bowl of soup was real. My love has no price, but if you choose to walk away, I will respect that." Adama wept. But it wasn't just pain. It was relief. It was gratitude. Before her knelt a man stripped of wealth, a man who had chosen clay to rediscover his soul. The man in the suit tapped his foot impatiently. "Doctor, we must go. The city is waiting. Your front-page news everywhere." Medeva turned and replied, his voice firm. "The city can wait. Today, my future is not decided by headlines or shareholders. It's decided by her." The words fell like rain after a long drought. The entire village seemed to shrink inward, overwhelmed by the gravity of that moment. From that instant, no one saw Medeva as the mute man anymore. Respect bloomed suddenly on every face, even the hardest ones. Still on the ground, Adhama took a deep breath. She remembered every cold night, every spoon of soup, every dawn he spent holding her hand. She thought of her mother, of the humiliation, of the cruel laughter. She remembered the man who, though rich, carried sacks of corn, fetched herbs in the night, cared for his sick mother-in-law. Her hand tightened around his like someone holding on to a branch in a raging river. She said nothing, but the gesture spoke loud and clear. "I see you and I accept you." In that moment, destiny changed. Not because of gold, but because of a truth spoken out loud. And there, at the village gate, a new story was born. Not just for Adharma, not just for Medeva, but for the entire village. The truth at last had stepped out of the dark with the force of a gentle thunder, ripping the night open to announce the day. After the truth exploded at the village gate like thunder on a dry night, the village was never the same. The dust that had clouded the people's eyes settled, revealing what no one had wanted to see: a man hidden behind silence and a strong woman hidden behind tears. The next morning, Medeva sat in the yard, his face still marked by the weight of the day before. Adhama was beside him in silence, holding her scarf with both hands. The wind moved slowly, carrying the scent of green corn, firewood smoke, and the whisper of a fate knocking at their door. The man in the suit returned, less impatient now, as if understanding that some decisions cannot be rushed. He placed a large suitcase on the ground and said, "The city is ready to receive you. There's a car waiting, a mansion, staff, clean clothes, soft beds, warm food. You don't need to live here anymore." Medeva turned to Adharma. His eyes were a silent prayer, an invitation without chains. "Come with me. I want to give you the world I left behind. I want to give you the comfort you never had. I want you to walk beside me, not behind. I want you to be seen as a queen, not as a burden." Adharma didn't respond immediately. Her heart was a stormy sea full of old waves, the pain of being sold, the emptiness of cold nights, the quiet warmth of his hands holding hers. She remembered the thin mattress, the weak fire, the bland porridge. She remembered the bitter words of the neighbors, the sharp laughter, the looks of pity. But she also remembered the nights when Medeva stayed awake brewing tea for her mother, the days when he returned from the fields carrying heavy sacks, never complaining the times he chose to sleep on the floor to protect her last shred of dignity. "And my mother?" she asked, her voice soft like a candle flickering. Medeva took her hand. "She comes with us. No one will be left behind. Not her, not the village." The man in the suit frowned, confused. "The village? What do you mean?" Medeva turned to him, his eyes bright with conviction. "I want to help these people. I want to bring medicine, food, tools. I want to build a school, a well, a community garden. I'm not just Allendowner. I am a son of this land. And no one turns their back on their roots." Silence fell like a veil over everything. The neighbors listening from behind the trees looked at each other with shame. The men felt a tightness in their chests, remembering the days they had mocked him. Adama lowered her head, her tears dripping onto the clay floor. But it wasn't sorrow. It was gratitude. It was the closing of a wound that had been open far too long. She took a deep breath and raised her head. "I'll go, but I won't go alone. I'll go with my mother with you. And I want everyone to know I leave this place a whole woman, not a coin that was traded." Medeva squeezed her hands, his face breaking into a smile like sunlight after a long rain. "You were never a coin. You were always root flower strength." The man in the suit stepped back, giving space to the moment. Inside, Aminata had heard everything. When Adharma entered the room, her mother gripped her arm with surprising strength. "My daughter, I candy in peace now. You found a man who didn't buy you. He chose you. And you never lost yourself along the way." Adhama dropped to her knees beside the bed, crying in her mother's lap. Aminata stroked her hair like she did when Adhama was a little girl, when they still believed the world was fair. "Go, my daughter. Go live what I never could. Carry this village in your heart. Show the world that clay can bloom." 2. That night, Medeva sat on the makeshift porch staring at the stars. Adama's scarf lay folded beside him like a promise of new beginnings. Adama stepped outside, sat next to him, and rested her head on his broad shoulder. "Are you sure?" she asked. Medeva turned, looking straight into her eyes. "The only thing I'm sure of is you. The rest is just road." The full moon lit up the yard, revealing every stone, every dry leaf, every memory carved into the earth. There they decided not just to change homes, but to change lives without forgetting who they had been, without abandoning the clay that shaped them. The invitation to the city wasn't an escape. It was a new beginning, a chance to turn pain into roots, humiliation into education, hunger into harvest. Adama wasn't leaving as the wife of a billionaire. She was leaving as a woman who walked through mud with her own feet. as a daughter who carried her mother on her back, as a soul who learned to love with no medals, no crowns. And so in the silence of that dawn, they sealed a pact no time, no wealth, no sharp tongue could ever break, a pact between two hearts that learned to speak without sound, to see without light, and to love without expecting anything in return. The months passed like rains that come without warning, washing everything, stripping away dead leaves, leaving the ground ready to bloom. Medeva and Adha left the village on a clear morning. Aminata nestled on an improvised bench wrapped in soft cloths. The road felt endless, but each bump was a promise of renewal, each turn a silent prayer from those who dream of returning with heads held high. In the big city, Adhama saw the world through the eyes of someone who had always walked barefoot on earth. The lights sparkled like fallen stars. The buildings rose like mountains, and the cars rushed by like startled beasts. But she didn't get lost. She kept the scarf in her pocket, remembering the clay, the cold nights, and the cruel laughter that shaped her strength. Aminata, though weak, regained a light in her eyes upon seeing her daughter walk beside Medeva, not as a shadow, but as an equal. She murmured quiet blessings, asking the ancestors to protect each step of that new path. Medeva, now dressed in clean, modest clothes, began to use his fortune as a tool, not a crown. He invested in machinery, dug wells, built granaries, but in his heart he carried the village, a longing that pulsed on his skin. Adharma stood beside him in every decision, every contract, every meeting. She didn't sit at the table just to decorate. She gave opinions, asked questions, noticed every detail, showing the world that even born from clay, she could read souls better than any paper. When everything was ready, they chose to return, but not as royalty, not with drums or decorated horses. They returned in trucks filled with food, seeds, tools, boxes of medicine, clothes, and books. The engines roared before the sun had fully risen. The village woke startled. Doors opened slowly. Eyes peeked through cracks, expecting mockery, expecting a parade. But what they saw was different. Medeva stepped down first. The old hoe slung over his shoulder, his face sunburnt, his feet firm on the ground. The same man who once carried sacks of corn in silence. Behind him came a dammer, the scarf still in her pocket, her smile small but steady, her gaze embracing every inch of that soil. The women rushed to see. Some covered their mouths. Others let their wash basins crash to the ground. The men stood still, hands dirty with earth, unable to speak. Children, curious, drew closer, their eyes sparkling at the sight of colorful packages, books, and improvised toys. Medeva called everyone to the village center. His voice, now free, rang like a drum on a feast day. "I've returned. Not to humiliate, not to collect. I came back to repay what you taught me. I came back to show that wealth is not gold hoarded but life shared." Adama walked among the women, holding trembling hands, embracing those who had once laughed at her. Each embrace was a silent forgiveness, each look an answer that didn't need to be spoken. They built a well in the center of the village so no one would ever again walk miles for clean water. They raised a small school, solid, made of firm clay, good wood, and love in every brick. They handed out seeds to restart the fields, clothes for the elders, toys for the children. Aminata, now more fragile, was brought in a chair beneath a cashew tree. There she watched the grandson of the ville's most infamous gossip, running with a book in hand, shouting with joy. She saw her daughters smiling without fear, now called the flower that grew from clay. The mother took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "It was worth the wait. Every tear was worth it." Bachari, the father, who had sold his daughter into marriage, stayed behind in the doorway. An old man now, hunched and hollowed, harvesting the weight of his choices. No one told him to stay inside, but the silence of the village pushed him back. A quiet farewell from a world that no longer needed his kind of power. There, alone, he felt the chill of having no one to hold his hand on gray days. That afternoon, while the sun painted the sky orange and purple, Adama went to the backyard to harvest corn. The kernels shone like small promises, tough, full of life. Looking to the side, she saw Medeva crouched in the dirt, hands muddy, face sweaty. He looked up and she smiled. A quiet smile of someone who understands everything without needing to ask. In her mind, a phrase echoed, "The greatest wealth is knowing who covered you on the coldest night." And there, among the cornstalks, her heart full of stories and her hands full of life, Adama understood that destiny doesn't make mistakes. It just takes its time. The village that once mocked now applauded, not out of fear but out of respect, not from obligation but gratitude. And there in that forgotten corner of the world, a poor woman once sold as a debt returned as her own. A woman hall, mistress of her fate, a root that blossomed in clay. Their return was not about gold, mansions, or luxury. It was about soul, about proving that when love is planted in silence, the harvest comes, and one day the whole world must bow its head and learn. The village returned to its rhythm after the storm of emotions. But nothing was quite the same. The women who once mocked Adama now looked at her as one might gaze upon a living saint. The men who used to spit on the ground as Mediva passed now lowered their heads in respect. Children ran between the new vegetable beds, laughing loud and free like birds released after the rain. Adama became known as the flower that bloomed from clay. To many it was poetry. To her it was truth. She knew the cost of every petal, every root, every drop of water that had nourished her courage. The scarf that once hid her face became a symbol. The women began wearing scarves like hers, not to hide, but to remember that every woman carries a strength within her, waiting for the right moment to wake. Aminata lived her final years with dignity. No longer did she need to stretch out her hand for a handful of flour. No longer did she hear the whispers of neighbors at the well. She had a soft bed, a breezy room, warm tea on cold mornings, and sincere hugs at dusk. But most of all, she had peace. The peace of watching her daughter bloom, of breathing in the sweet scent of a life rebuilt, and of having a son-in-law who, even while carrying the weight of the world, always found time to hold her hand, listen to her memories. Mediva, though he could afford the finest garments, still wore simple clothes. The old hat, the worn hoe, his bare feet in the clay. He understood that the greatest wealth doesn't wear silk. He had learned that the soul cannot accept luxuries that suffocate. And so, with dirty hands and a clean heart, he became the most respected man the village had ever seen. Bikari, the father-in-law, aged beneath the shadow of his choices. His door creaked, but noon knocked. His pots emptied. The laughter faded. The feet that once rushed to ask favors disappeared. Theman, who traded his daughter for a moment's relief, now harvested solitude as his final crop. The last time Adamer passed his house, she paused, looking at the old man through the window. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a deep silence, heavy like a moonless night. Then she moved on because the past once forgiven no longer holds the power to bind your steps. The final scene stayed etched in the hearts of those who saw it. A Dharma in the yard harvesting corn, the sun setting, painting the sky with colors that looked like God's own brushstrokes. She paused, looked back, and saw Mediva sitting on the ground, fixing a broken hoe, sweat on his face, hands steady, eyes focused. She took a deep breath, breathing in the scent of fresh corn, of damp earth, of a love that didn't need words. Then she smiled, a full smile, wide and alive. The kind of smile only someone who has once died inside and been reborn can understand. At that moment, a phrase echoed in her chest, soft as a breeze in the early morning. The greatest wealth is falling asleep, knowing who covered you on the coldest night. And so the girl who was sold became a woman revered. The scorned wife became a silent queen. The forgotten daughter became pride, and the mistreated soul became a deep-rooted foundation strong enough to hold not just a home, but an entire people. In the village, many still tell this story around the fire like a secret passed from generation to generation. They say that every woman carries clay inside her ready to become a flower, and every man carries hidden gold ready to become soul. What remained wasn't the mansion nor the money, nor the contracts. What remained was the living lesson. True love cannot be bought, sold, or begged for. It is planted, nurtured, harvested, and then shared with those hungry for something real. And so the village learned to see silence with new eyes. And Adharma, the flower from the clay, continued harvesting corn beside the man who once chose to live without a crown, to find a love without a price. And at the end of each day, when the sun disappears and the world quiets, her last prayer is always the same. May God always give me hands to plant and arms to embrace, because the greatest fortune in the world is falling asleep, knowing who covered you on the coldest.